December 20th, 1820. In a fog-draped farmhouse along the Red River bottomland of Robertson County, Tennessee, a man who had once been the most respected landowner in his community lay unconscious in his bed, his body wasted to a husk, his breathing shallow and wet. By morning, John Bell would be dead, and whatever had killed him would stand over his corpse and laugh. That is not a metaphor. That is what the witnesses said they heard. What had descended upon the Bell family farm over the preceding 3 years, sir, has never been explained. It was not a ghost story whispered by illiterate settlers around a fire. It was a documented, multi-year ordeal witnessed by hundreds of people, investigated by one of the most powerful military figures in American history, and recorded in sworn testimonies that survive to this day. Parapsychologist, Dr. Nandor Fodor, a man of considerable academic standing, would eventually call it America's greatest haunting. What most people call it is simply the Bell Witch. And before this story is over, that name will carry a weight that no comfortable word like legend or folklore can contain. To understand what happened to John Bell, you have to understand what he had built and what it meant to lose it in the way that he did. John Bell arrived in Robertson County, Tennessee from North Carolina sometime around 1804, a man with deep roots in the Baptist faith, a steady hand for farming, and enough ambition to carve something lasting out of the Tennessee frontier. He purchased land along the Red River bottomland and set about expanding it with quiet, methodical determination. By the time his troubles began, he had accumulated 328 acres of cleared and cultivated farmland, a large family house, and a reputation as a man of integrity. He served as an elder of the Red River Baptist Church. His neighbors respected him. His wife, Lucy Bell, was spoken of with a warmth that bordered on reverence. Their children were healthy and numerous. By every visible measure, John Bell had done exactly what a man of his era and his faith was supposed to do. He had built a righteous life in a hard land. The land, it turned out, was not finished with him yet. In the summer of 1817, John Bell was walking through his cornfields on a warm afternoon when he encountered an animal sitting motionless between 2 rows of corn. He stopped. The creature turned its head toward him, and what he saw made no natural sense. It had the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit, 2 sets of anatomy that had no business belonging to the same creature. Bell raised his rifle and fired. The animal vanished, not fled, not bolted into the underbrush, vanished the way a thought vanishes when you try to look at it directly. Bell told himself it was nothing, a trick of afternoon light perhaps, an unfamiliar animal he had simply never encountered before. He put it out of his mind and went back to the house for supper. That evening, as the family gathered after the meal and the Tennessee night settled in around the log walls of the farmhouse, they heard the first sound. It came from outside, a rhythmic, heavy beating against the exterior walls. Bell and his sons went out with lanterns. They found nothing, no animal tracks. No signs of disturbance in the soil near the foundation, no broken branches in the surrounding brush. They went back inside. The sounds resumed almost immediately. This became the rhythm of the Bell household for weeks. The beating at the walls, the gnawing sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, as though something were working its way through the timber from the inside. At night, the children would wake screaming, insisting that rats were eating their bedposts. Then came the next escalation, the sound of chains being dragged slowly across the wooden floorboards. The sensation, in the dark, of bed covers being pulled from the body with sudden, deliberate force. Pillows lifted from beneath sleeping heads and thrown across the room by hands that were not there. John Bell was a religious man and a rational man, and he did not reach for an explanation until every natural one had been exhausted. He checked for animals in the walls. He reinforced the exterior. He sat up at night with his sons, listening. Whatever was in that house was not an animal, and it was not the wind, and after months of sleepless, frightened nights, he made a decision that cost him something. He told his secret to his nearest neighbor, James Johnston. Johnston was skeptical. Men of that era were not given to believing in spirits without evidence, and Johnston was no exception. He agreed to spend a night at the Bell farm with his wife, more as a gesture of goodwill toward a troubled friend than out of any genuine expectation of witnessing something supernatural. That first evening was uneventful. The Johnstons sat with the Bells, ate supper, swapped conversation, and retired to their guest room, feeling that perhaps John Bell had simply been under too much strain. Then it started. Their bed covers were ripped off in the darkness. The force was not gentle, not gradual. It was sudden and violent, the kind of pull that required intention. James Johnston was struck. He sprang out of bed in the darkness and shouted into the room, demanding to know in the name of the Lord who was present and what they wanted. The silence that followed was absolute, and then the rest of the night passed without incident. The next morning, Johnston looked at John Bell with the expression of a man who has just been required to revise his understanding of the world. What Bell had in his home, Johnston said quietly, was a spirit, the kind the Bible talked about. He had no other explanation. And he offered none beyond that. But the fact that an outside witness, a man with no stake in the story and no reason to fabricate, had experienced exactly what the Bell family described was significant. Word began to spread. What came next is where the story stops being merely unsettling and begins to be something more genuinely strange. The entity found its voice. It began as barely anything, a whispering heard usually in the evenings that family members described as resembling the voice of a very old woman singing church hymns. The sound was thin and faint, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of a farmhouse at night. And at first the Bells could not be certain they were hearing it at all. But the voice grew stronger. Week by week, month by month, it accumulated clarity and power until it was no longer a whisper at all, but a full, unmistakable female voice that could fill a room and be heard from the yard outside. And it was not silent. It sang. It recited scripture with the fluency of a seminary scholar. It carried on extended conversations with visitors. It argued theology. It gossiped with apparent knowledge of events happening in households miles away. On one occasion, it repeated, word for word, 2 separate sermons that had been delivered simultaneously in 2 different churches 13 miles apart, on the same day at the same hour. The people who had attended both those services confirmed the accuracy of what was recited. This detail is important because it breaks a certain category of easy explanation. A human fraud, however clever, could not simultaneously be in 2 distant places, and yet the voice had been. While it communicated freely and sometimes almost playfully with certain members of the household, the entity's treatment of the family was not uniform. Lucy Bell, John's wife, was a particular object of its favor. Visitors reported hearing the voice speak of her in terms of genuine warmth, calling her the most perfect woman it had ever known. It would leave fresh fruit on her bed. It would sing hymns to her at night when she was ill, and observers noted that its tone during those moments was different from any other time, softer, almost tender. Whatever this entity was, it had affections. It had preferences. It had, in the most disturbing sense, a personality. And it had a target. From early in the haunting, the entity made clear that it harbored a specific and implacable hatred for one person in the Bell household, John Bell himself. It called him Old Jack Bell, and the name was not affectionate. It was contemptuous. It cursed him with an inventiveness and persistence that observers found almost difficult to describe. It removed his shoes when he tried to walk across the room. It slapped him during his most vulnerable moments. When he sat down to eat, his jaw would seize. When he tried to speak in company, his tongue and lips would stiffen until speech became impossible. The physical symptoms that the entity appeared to inflict upon John Bell have drawn the attention of medical historians in more recent times. The jaw stiffening, the difficulty swallowing, the progressive weakness, and what witnesses described as seizures. All these are symptoms consistent with several serious conditions, among them arsenic poisoning, which was used medicinally and was widely available in early 19th century Tennessee. Some researchers have gone as far as proposing that Bell was being slowly poisoned and that the theatrical manifestations around him served, whether intentionally or not, as cover for that very human crime. But this theory, while plausible on the surface, does nothing to explain the voice that 200 witnesses from across 3 states traveled to hear. It does not explain the wagon that stopped on its own. It does not explain what happened to Andrew Jackson. In 1819, when the legend of the Bell Witch had spread far enough to reach Nashville, it reached the ears of General Andrew Jackson, then a military hero celebrated across the young American Republic for his role in the Battle of New Orleans. Jackson had a particular personal connection to the region. He owned land near the Red River settlement, and John Bell's own sons, including John Jr. and Drury, had fought under him at New Orleans. When Jackson heard the account, he did what a man of his temperament and curiosity would do. He decided to go and see for himself. He assembled an entourage of several men, equipped them well, and set out on the road to the Bell farm. As the group's wagon drew near to the Bell property, crossing a muddy creek bed on a road the horses had navigated without difficulty moments before, the wagon stopped. The horses strained forward, muscles rolling, hooves churning into the mud, but the wagon would not move. The men climbed down, inspected the wheels, the axle, the ground beneath. There was no mechanical cause for the stoppage. There was nothing there. After several minutes of confusion, during which Jackson grew increasingly frustrated, a disembodied female voice spoke from somewhere near the wagon, informing the party that they were free to proceed and that she would be seeing them later that evening. The wheels turned. The horses moved forward without resistance. Jackson, who had faced British artillery and survived, reportedly turned to his men with an expression none of them had seen before. "By the Eternal," he said, "that must be the Bell Witch." That evening, Jackson sat with the Bells and told war stories while his men set up camp in the yard. The mood was cautious, but almost festive. One of the men in the entourage had been boasting throughout the journey that he was a witch tamer, a man experienced in confronting and disabling supernatural entities. He produced a silver pistol and claimed its bullet would destroy any spirit it struck, and that the reason nothing had yet occurred was that whatever haunted this farm was already afraid of him. The response was immediate and merciless. The man screamed. He began twisting and jerking as though being struck from multiple directions at once, yelling that something was stabbing him with pins, that he was being beaten. Then a force of enormous and invisible specificity delivered a kick to his posterior, so severe that he was propelled through the front doorway of the Bell home and into the yard. The other men stood and watched in silent horror. The voice then spoke again, cheerful and calm, announcing that there was one more fraud in Jackson's party and that she would identify that second man the following evening. Jackson wanted to stay. He insisted. He wanted to know who the second man was. His companions, seasoned soldiers who had stood their ground against men and cannon, begged him to leave. They were not going to spend another night there. Jackson argued, he reasoned, he threatened, but in the end, the will of his men carried the night. By early the following morning, Jackson and his party were spotted in Springfield, traveling back toward Nashville. Andrew Jackson, the man who would become the 7th President of the United States, had fled the Bell farm in the dark. He is later reported to have said that he would rather fight the British again at New Orleans than spend another night with the Bell Witch. While Jackson's visit added the weight of public credibility to the haunting, life on the farm continued its slow deterioration. At the center of that deterioration was a young woman named Betsy Bell, John's youngest daughter, who had borne more of the entity's direct physical violence than anyone else in the household. Her face had been struck. Her hair had been pulled until it came away in handfuls. Her skin had been left with red welts in the shapes of hands. She had grown up in a house that was not safe, in the company of something that wished her family harm, and she had survived it with a quietness that must have required extraordinary reserves of inner strength. Betsy had begun to court a young man from a neighboring family, Joshua Gardner. The relationship was a good one, accepted by both families, and the two had made plans to marry. For a time, this represented the one hopeful, forward-looking element in the Bell family's existence. The possibility that life could proceed, that ordinary things like love and marriage and futures could still be claimed even in a haunted house. The entity disagreed. It expressed its opposition to the engagement with a fury that had no apparent logic. It followed Betsy and Joshua everywhere. To the river, where young people gathered on warm afternoons. To the fields. Even to the limestone cave at the edge of the Bell property, a natural formation that ran deep into the hillside above the Red River, where the two tried to find moments of peace away from the farm. The voice pursued them. It commanded, pleaded, cursed, wept. It ordered Betsy not to marry Joshua Gardner with a repetition that had the quality of something obsessive, something that could not let go. Some who have studied the case carefully have noted that the entity's opposition to the engagement intensified at precisely the moments when Betsy appeared happiest, as though joy in this young woman was itself a provocation. There is a shadow over this part of the story, one that has never fully resolved. Betsy's former school teacher was a man named Richard Powell, who was 11 years her senior, possessed of unusual intellectual attainments in mathematics, geology, and horticulture, and who had made no secret of his personal interest in Betsy, even while, unknown to most of the Red River community, he was secretly married to a woman in Nashville. Some researchers have wondered whether Powell, who was known to have studied ventriloquism and certain fringe sciences of his day, had something to do with the haunting. It is a theory that has never been proven, and it leaves many of the most inexplicable events entirely unexplained. But it is the kind of shadow that follows a story like this one and refuses to be dismissed. What is certain is that the pressure on Betsy Bell proved too much to bear. On Easter Monday of 1821, she met Joshua Gardner at the river. She told him the engagement was over. No account of that meeting has preserved her exact words or his, or whether they stood in silence for a long time, looking at the water before she walked away. But the engagement ended that day. And with it, one of the last ordinary futures John Bell's household had managed to hold on to. The entity had, by the end, accomplished many things. But what it did to John Bell himself remains the story's darkest and most irresolvable center. Bell's physical decline had accelerated through the autumn of 1820. The twitching in his face had become a near-constant tremor. Swallowing had grown so difficult that eating was an ordeal. The seizures, which had come occasionally at first, came now with regularity, and they left him diminished each time, a little more hollowed out, a little less present in the room where his family gathered around him. He had become confined to the house. He could no longer walk the fields he had built over 2 decades. He could no longer stand in the pulpit of the Red River Baptist Church as the elder he had been. The entity that had declared its intention to kill him appeared to be keeping its word methodically and with patience, removing his shoes when he tried to walk, slapping his face in the aftermath of each seizure, filling the farmhouse with cursing and invective directed at old Jack Bell as though it wished him to die conscious of its contempt. On the morning of December 19th, 1820, John Bell did not wake up. His family gathered around him. Dr. George Hobson was called. Bell lay in a coma, his breathing the only evidence of life remaining in him, and the household entered that particular suspended anguish that comes when a death is certain but has not yet arrived. During the night, they found a small vial tucked into the corner of the kitchen cupboard. It contained a dark liquid, nearly black, with no smell anyone could clearly identify. No one in the household had placed it there. John Bell, Jr. pulled a length of straw from a broom and touched the tip to the liquid, then touched the tip to the tongue of one of the family cats. The cat convulsed, launched itself into the air, twisted, and fell dead before it reached the floor. In the silence that followed, the entity's voice rose in the house with a sound the witnesses described as gleeful. She had given old Jack a big dose of that last night, she said. It had fixed him. John Bell, Jr. picked up the vial and walked to the fireplace and threw it into the flames. It detonated in a surge of brilliant blue fire that shot up the chimney and lit the night outside the house. Whatever it was gone. John Bell died the following morning, December 20th, 1820. He was somewhere in his 50s. He left behind a wife who had loved him genuinely, children who had watched him be destroyed by something no one could name or explain, and 328 acres of Tennessee farmland soaked in a story that would outlive everyone who had witnessed it. His funeral was the largest Robertson County had ever seen. People came from miles away, from neighboring counties, from towns they had traveled to on horseback over difficult roads, because the death of John Bell was not merely the death of a farmer. It was the conclusion of something that the region had been watching and discussing and fearing for 3 years. 2 Methodist ministers and 1 Baptist eulogized him. The crowd of mourners was dense and quiet in the cold December air around the graveyard. And then the entity spoke. Its voice rose over the cemetery, singing a coarse, drinking song, full-throated and apparently delighted. And it continued singing until the last mourner had walked away from the grave. No comfort of dignity was permitted. No silence of grief was honored. Whatever had lived in that farmhouse for 3 years stood over John Bell's body in the winter morning and celebrated. In April of 1821, several weeks after Betsy's broken engagement, the entity paid one final visit to Lucy Bell and told her that it was leaving. It would be gone for 7 years, it said, and then it would return. Lucy Bell, who had endured the haunting with a composure that had earned her the entity's stated admiration, listened to this announcement and said nothing that anyone recorded. The entity kept its promise. It returned in 1828, spending several weeks in extended conversation with John Bell Jr. and 2 other sons, Richard and Joel. What it spoke of during this return was different in character from the violence and hatred of the earlier years. It discussed at considerable length the origin of life, the nature of civilization, the requirements of Christian faith, and the moral failures that would eventually fracture the young republic in which the Bell Farm stood. It predicted the coming of the Civil War with a specificity that would not have seemed credible to the people listening in 1828, but which reads differently in retrospect. And then it left again, promising that it would return once more in 107 years to visit the most direct living descendant of John Bell. The year of the promised third return was 1935. In 1934, a Nashville physician named Dr. Charles Bailey Bell, a neurologist and the great-grandson of John Bell Sr., published a book about the haunting, apparently to alert those who knew the family to what was coming. He died in 1945. Whether the entity returned in 1935, as it had promised, no one who left a record was prepared to say definitively. Some of those who knew the family said the Bell Witch had never truly left at all. The primary written record of these events was assembled by Martin Van Buren Ingram, a newspaper editor from Clarksville who had grown up in the Red River community and conducted extensive interviews with surviving witnesses over a period of decades. He published his work in 1894 under the title An Authenticated History of the Famous Bell Witch. The book drew primarily from a manuscript called Our Family Trouble, written in John Bell's own lifetime by his son, Richard Williams Bell, who had been a child during the haunting and recorded what he witnessed from memory. Richard Bell's manuscript had been held back from publication by agreement within the family until the last immediate child of John Bell had died. Joel Egbert Bell, the youngest child, died in 1890, and only then was the account released to the world. The book Ingram produced is imperfect, as all early accounts of oral tradition necessarily are. But its source material includes people who were present in those rooms, who heard that voice, who felt those hands in the dark. Robertson County historian and parapsychologist investigators who have examined the case have noted with particular consistency that the Bell Witch haunting stands apart from most documented hauntings in a specific and significant way. Almost every other case of its kind depends on a single witness, or a small cluster of witnesses who might be explained away by shared hysteria, grief, or suggestion. The Bell haunting had hundreds of independent witnesses over a span of years. Military officers, physicians, clergy, educators, farmers. None of these people had a common motive to fabricate the same specific story. And yet the accounts they left behind are, in their essential details, the same. What remains unknown is the most important thing. No one has ever identified with certainty what the entity was, where it came from, or why it chose John Bell. Various explanations have been offered over the century and a half since the haunting ended, or appeared to end. Some have proposed that the entity was the spirit of Kate Batts, an eccentric neighbor with whom Bell had a business dispute involving a land transaction. At one point, the voice itself claimed to be old Kate Batts's witch, and the name Kate has followed the legend ever since. But this explanation is unsatisfying on multiple levels. The entity contradicted itself repeatedly when asked to identify itself. It gave different names and origins in different conversations. It claimed at various times to be a Native American spirit disturbed from a burial mound on the Bell property. It named itself as the leader of a family of spirits with names like Black Dog, Mathematics, and Jerusalem. Whatever it was, it did not seem to have a fixed answer to the question of its own nature, which is either the deepest kind of mystery or the mark of something that had no single origin to give. The Bell Witch Cave sits today at the end of a gravel road in what is now Adams, Tennessee. It is a karst formation approximately 490 feet long, running into the limestone hillside above the Red River, the same cave where Betsy Bell and Joshua Gardner sought moments of quiet in the years before their engagement was destroyed. Tours are given during summer months. People come from far away. Some report nothing. Some report that their photographs develop showing things that were not there when the pictures were taken. Some report hearing sounds in the deep interior of the cave that do not match any known geological or biological source. The land around the old Bell farm has continued to generate accounts of strange phenomena for 200 years, with a consistency that is either remarkable or simply the inevitable product of a landscape saturated in one of the most powerful stories the American South has ever produced. In the end, what the Bell Witch haunting leaves behind is not primarily a question about the supernatural. It leaves behind a question about human beings and what they can endure. John Bell built his life with patience and faith and physical labor, and whatever came for him did not come quickly. It came gradually, accumulating force across years until the man who had stood at the center of it all was reduced to something that could not walk across a room without his shoes being stolen by invisible hands. His daughter had her hair torn out and her face struck by something she could never see. His wife was sung to by an entity that respected her even as it destroyed everything around her. His son sat with something in 1828 and listened to it predict the end of the world they knew. And then it left. And then it came back. And then, if you believe the family, it never truly left at all. The mystery of what happened along the Red River bottomland of Robertson County in the years between 1817 and 1821 has never been solved. The most qualified researchers who have examined the evidence have not offered a rational explanation. Only the acknowledgement that something happened, something that hundreds of people witnessed, something that killed a man. Something that knew things it had no natural way of knowing, that spoke with authority about Scripture and sermons and the interior lives of people dozens of miles away, that predicted a civil war and promised to return across more than a century of time. The name it answered to was Kate. The man it destroyed was John Bell. The ground it inhabited still stands in Tennessee, and the cave still runs deep into the limestone, and the questions it left behind have never been answered to anyone's satisfaction. Some things that happen in this world refuse to be explained. The Bell Witch haunting is one of them. John Bell is buried in the old family cemetery near Adams, Tennessee, under a stone that has been standing for 200 years. On the morning they lowered him into that ground, something laughed over his grave. No one has ever explained that either. This script is grounded in documented historical accounts, primary sources including Richard Williams Bell's manuscript Our Family Trouble, Martin V. Ingram's 1894, and authenticated history of the famous Bell Witch, Robertson County historical records, and contemporaneous eyewitness testimonies preserved in the Tennessee State Library and Archives.